Well, hello. This is the final conference of our 12th Principia International Symposium, which will be given by Professor Bas van Fraassen. After that, we'll have the closing ceremony, which I promise will be quite short. And we're going to have the Principia online party on GatherTown, so don't miss it. So please, let's welcome Bas. He's a professor at Princeton University, retired since 2008, and now at San Francisco State University. He's an old friend of our community. Actually, it's quite special to me because my first Principia Symposium back when I was a master's student, it was in 2007, a few years ago. That was about the philosophy of Bas van Fraassen. That was the main topic. And well, at that time, I was a master's student. I was in the staff. I could never imagine back then that I would ever be chairing a session with his presence. So it's really great. It's really important. At that moment, that was, well, it was very inspiring to me to see his conference and to see lots of people discussing the philosophy of Bas van Fraassen, which was the topic of the symposium. So well, let's welcome Professor Bas. Also this week, I must say, Bas has been, as we call it in Brazilian Portuguese, a warrior, guerreiro. He spent most of the week in a hospital because of an accident, but insisted all the time in assuring us of his recovery and of his participation in Principia. So yeah, Bas, we thank you very much for your presence, for your contribution to our discussion, to our community, for so much time. And well, thank you very much for being here, for being with us, for accepting our invitation. And well, let's hear you. So the title Bas sent us is A Landscape of Logics Beyond the Deduction Theorem and Moore's Paradox. So thank you, Bas, and welcome.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you, all the organizers. I'm very happy that you invited me, and very happy that I can join you now. I'm much regret that I have essentially missed the conference because of this mishap. I look forward to seeing the papers that come out in Principia. So I also have to thank the organizers for something rather special. I asked them that I would be allowed to give a talk that was a bit far from the main topic of the conference. Now, a rather logic talk, but not a very formal logic talk. What I do want to say about it is that the motivation for it is Moore's paradox, the puzzle that I've had over Moore's paradox for a long time, including with certain issues in philosophy of science. And I talked about it at one point in my book on scientific representation, that really it brings up issues that are related to issues that I see in the general subject of modeling and representation. But it would take another paper to spell out these connections. So the paper has a preamble and 3 parts. The preamble is now finished. I'm going to share the screen, and after that, you'll not see so much of me. Are you seeing the screen, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so
we see the screen and we see you, don't worry.
Oh, okay. So the first page is essentially the preamble I just gave in a few words, and I will explain the Moore's paradox when we come to it. The fact is that I will come to it in the third of the 3 parts of the paper, where I will show how I want to propose a treatment of this paradox that is actually that is located in this landscape of a different sort of logic that I am describing in the first 2. Now, when I say different, I don't mean very different. They are, in a straightforward sense, classical logics. but you will quickly see that there's some differences, some distinctions to be made about classical logic. The first question that we'll talk about is exactly what should we take as classical logic, and have been two very different understandings of this, separated by the deduction theorem, I would like to say, but that's a bit fanciful. I also want to make a distinction between pure classical logic and applied logic. In philosophy of science, we are interested in applied logic that pertain to a language in which the words have meaning, and there are connections between these words and the sentences due to these meanings. The second part then is a proposal for a very general semantic analysis of one kind of applied logic, what I call the rule extended logics. And then in the third part, I will show how I can offer or propose the treatment of Moore's paradox within that framework. So what is classical logic? Well, we all teach it, don't we? I mean, to our first-year students, to our undergraduate students. And what we teach them is the natural deduction formulation, the one that is so easy and so natural and that we all follow. But that is not what the classical logic was to begin. When Frege and Russell and Whitehead presented it, they presented it as a system of axioms with essentially one rule, modus ponens. And that sort of system is now still called a Hilbert-style axiomatic system. Right? It was in 1934, so rather a number of decades after the birth of classical logic, that the natural deduction formulation came into being. Now we're going to see that these are not the same. When we teach them, and certainly when I was taught logic, I was never told that there could be any possible difference between them, any non-trivial difference. But they're not. The watershed was the deduction theorem by Hebrand in 1930. And what he proved was that if you have some premises, say X, and given those premises and adding an assumption, A, you can prove B. Well, then from those premises, what follows is the conditional, if A, then B. And of course, this is exactly what warrants what we now call conditional proof, this natural deduction rule of conditional proof. Technically speaking, we say it proves the admissibility of the rule of conditional proof, because there are no new theorems and no new direct inferences if you add conditional proof. Okay. But here already I can make a quick distinction. Conditional proof is not a direct inference rule. It's not like modus ponens. It is rather a rule from one inference to another inference. If on the left you see an inference, and if you're able to prove that that inference is correct, then you're allowed to infer another inference is correct. So it is a somewhat different kind of rule, and I want to make that distinction in the terminology. Direct inference rule, like modus ponens, inference to inference rule, like conditional proof. And at that point, of course, a number of other inference to inference rules were shown to be equally admissible, like proof by cases or disjunction introduction, or whatever you call it in your different logic books. Okay, fine. That's a little bit of history, and now what I want to turn to is not pure logic, but applied logic. And we can just think of classical propositional logic as it would apply in a language where the words actually have meaning. We don't just have symbols. Right? You would expect to have add some new principles that reflect what is meant in that language. Carnap talked about this, and he said, yes, we have to add meaning postulates. Right? Now, these can be added as extra axioms, and here's the first point. If you add new axioms, the deduction theorem still holds in just the same way. But if you add new rules, then the deduction theorem would have to be proved again. Because if ever you proof, you'll see that it hinges on modus ponens being the inference rule. Okay. Of course, there are rules that you just cannot add without trivializing what you're doing. And A.M. Pryor gave a very good example of this. He says, I'm introducing the connective tonk. And I will tell you what it is by giving you the inference rules that apply. From A, you get A tonk B. From A tonk B, you get B. And after that, he said, alle logische Spitzfindigkeit is now gone from the subject. That is, because now everything is derivable from everything. Sure, if you do that, you're adding a rule and you're trivializing the whole system. Question, are there also non-trivial rule extended logics? If the deduction theorem were to hold in every rule extended logic, then they would all be equivalent to axiom extended logics. And so there would be no non-trivial distinction at all. Well, I'm going to give an example. I guess we all know that there are languages, at least representations or parts of natural language that have been studied by logicians and philosophers that are not bivalent, in which not every statement is either true or false. They exist, okay? Now, if in such a language we add an operator, T, and by that we mean that if we say TP, we mean P is true, then whatever else happens in the interpretation of the language, whenever P is true, TP is true, and whenever TP is true, P is true. So obviously there are valid inference rules from P to TP and from TP to P, right? If the deduction theorem were to hold, then from those you would get also conditional statements. Now, already when I was a student in 1962, an undergraduate, which I guess you can figure is a long time ago, in an old book by William and Martha Neal, they had a quick and dirty proof that, oh, if that happens, then every language is bivalent. And you can see how it happens. I mean, you don't any longer have just a rule from A to TA. You have a conditional from A to TA because by conditional proof. And you don't just have a rule from not A to T not A, right? You have a conditional. And, well, transitivity, and then just translating the not horseshoe to or, every statement is either true or false. So, okay, non-bivalent languages are just ruled out by this. Well, the opposite conclusion is to say the rules were fine, but the deduction theorem cannot hold in a case like that. It's the use of conditional proof that led to 1 and 3, which is at fault. Okay, now, so the options when we find examples like that is, well, two, you can just reject it and say, we're not going to deal with that. These are like tonk rules. They are doing something weird. We don't understand it, whatever. Or you could accept the example as possibly a legitimate or intelligible proper extension of original classical logic. If we do that, then the next question is obvious. Well, if we add those rules, then we're adding something to the structure of the language. In effect, we are starting with a classical language and creating a somewhat different language. Right? What kind of interpretations fit that kind of language? And what kind of logic can we see when we see a language like that? So that's the end of part 1. I'm going to go to part 2. So here is the sort of example I have in mind. We're going to have a rule extended logic, call it XL, starting from a more basic classical system S. Now that could just be ordinary propositional logic, okay? Or it could be propositional logic with meaning postulates for the words. The language being classical, every valuation or interpretation, whatever you want to call it, every model assigns either a T or an F to some or all statements, normally all. A classical valuation is one that's defined on all statements and is truth functional for the horseshoe negation, okay? I'm going to assume that our system S has only classical valuations. Okay, keep it very classical. But then this system XL has to have something more, and it has a set R of non-logical rules that are added, and that are meant to capture the meanings of the words in this language. And, well, the interpretations of S are not going to respect those rules. That's clear. So this is how I would approach it. I would say, well, what we have to ask is, what can the world be like if it's going to be described in a language like that? If it can be described veridically in a language like that. And that means that the theorems of the system S are all true, and modus ponens is a valid direct inference rule, and so are the other rules, the non-logical rules. And putting it in terms of descriptions, I would say, well, the possibly true world descriptions, right? The descriptions of possible worlds, if you want to put it the other way, they have to be theories of XL that are classically satisfiable and consistent. Now, if they're theories of XL, it means they're also closed under the new rules, not just under modus ponens. And, okay, at this point, maybe some of you saw it coming, right? I'm going to introduce supervaluations because now I'll say that for this new language that is created on the basis of the old one, the admissible interpretations or admissible valuations are the supervaluations. And that means that whenever you have a theory of this system XL, an admissible valuation will assign true to a sentence if all the classical valuations do. And it'll assign F if all the classical valuations assign it F. And otherwise, we'll assign nothing at all. So, of course, it's a partial function. These are the supervaluations. Equivalently, you can just think of valuations as sets, and that you can just take the intersection. Namely, a supervaluation, it takes what is common to the classical valuations that satisfy that theory. And you will not have a bivalent language anymore. Classical theorems like A or not A are going to remain valid, but not every statement is true or false anymore. So there's a difference now between those two principles. Classical direct inferences like modus ponens, they are also all valid still. That's fine. The system XL has an automatic, immediate soundness and completeness proof. Any kid with a truth table can do it. Okay, it just falls right out of the relation between the supervaluations and the result for the system S. Assuming there are admissible valuations at all, and that you haven't created something that cannot stand on its own legs, then premises will semantically entail a conclusion if and only if that conclusion is derivable in the rule extended logic XL. Now, does that mean there's no work to be done? Yeah, unfortunately, of course. In any given case, there's going to be a lot of work to be done. But it doesn't have to, this not soundness and completeness anymore. That's old hat. That's, not the thing you have to worry about now. But what you do have to prove is non-triviality. I think maybe some of you remember that, look, I'm so old. I think back to things that happened in the 70s, right? And Robert Stolnacker had produced a beautiful system of logic for conditionals with probabilities. And then David Lewis, through what people call the bombshell, he showed that this logic has only models in which there are at most 4 distinct possibilities. Okay? Yeah, consistent, sound, complete, everything, but totally non-trivial, but totally trivial, right? There was a proof that this predictive system was trivial. Now, it's not the best possible example because Lewis tended to assume a lot of things that he believed in, but it's just the sort of thing that we now have to really worry about. If you already know how the semantic analysis goes, you already know what the interpretations of the language are, well, you have to show that there really are some, and not just one, and not just 2 or 4. You have to show that there's quite a rich array of admissible valuations in order to have an interesting example. I said that conditional proof would disappear, right? Because that's essentially comes with deduction theorem, and then everything goes wrong for the rule extended logics. Other natural deduction rules are also going to be in trouble. Very basic underlying principles of logic are still going to hold. They are the ones that are called the structural rules. And I just listed them. I'm not going to go through them, but there's something like, entailment is transitive, right? But any inference-to-inference rule that doesn't follow from these can be invalidated by some example of this using the construction I've just given. So literally, that is all that is common to all the rule extended logics. Right? Any particular rule extended logic may have more, but this is all that is common to them. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of how natural deduction rules are refuted. I'm going to do it at the end, when it's possible for me to give some more concrete examples after Moore's paradox. Okay. Take a sip. I finished the first and second part of the talk. And now let's talk about Moore's paradox. It's difficult to acknowledge that some of our beliefs are false without running into logical trouble. I suppose everybody knows the Preface paradox, but what I want to point to specifically is the one that Moore brought up. Moore wrote, almost 100 years ago. He was writing about Russell's theory of descriptions, and this example came up. Now, I don't remember what the exact example was. I think I know what it must have sort of looked like. Certainly I know the form of the example, because that's what everybody talking about it remembers. When a French philosopher like Jean-Paul Sartre gives an example, well, murder, mayhem, terrorism, Nazi occupation, but the English don't speak that way. It was probably an example like there's a goldfish in the garden or something like that. The point is that the example was something of the form P and I don't believe that P. Now, there are true statements like that. For example, at the moment, I don't know what's happening in Tokyo at the moment. I can't watch the Olympics in real time. It may be raining there. I have no idea. But either it's raining or it's not. So if it's raining, the following is also true. It is raining, and I do not believe that it's raining. And if it's not raining, then it is true that it is not raining, and I do not believe that it's not raining. So it's clear that there are true statements of that sort. But Moore was pointing out that it is not possible for us to believe that. If you were to express the content of your belief with something like this, you would be showing that your beliefs are incoherent. You cannot believe that on pain of incoherence. I can never knowingly and truly assert them. That's Moore's paradox. There are true statements all around us that we cannot believe. Fine. Well, we don't fall into that kind of trap. I think maybe a very crude automaton that was collecting data and also then making notes about what it had collected might actually at some point, for a little while at least, have statements like that in its cognitive content, so to speak, right? We never do. We don't. We don't fall into that. The question is, why don't we? I mean, under what conditions does one not? And there were suggestions about this. Suggestion was that there must be it doesn't look like a logical contradiction, but there must be a hidden somewhere logical contradiction. When I believe something, I believe it to be true. That's certainly the case. So shouldn't we say that whatever I believe to be true? And the reason I don't believe a more paradox is because I believe the opposite. And so the action that we would add would be, I believe that if I believe P, then P. Looks very strong though, doesn't it? Looks stronger than something you would probably like to say about yourself. Hintica and Rich Thomason and Charles Cross all played with this. And then what Thomason showed that if the language is sufficiently rich and the speaker is sufficiently self-aware, then you get to a contradiction with a Gödel-type argument. So I think we should say that's not on. But maybe I thought the clue might be this word self-aware. Maybe it is the self-awareness that keeps us out. So what could we put down as a principle? Well, okay, you always have to idealize in these cases. I'm going to propose an idealization, what I'll call the self-transparent believer. The self-transparent believer may have lots and lots of false beliefs. But what she is right about is what her beliefs are. She may be wrong about much, but she's clear about it. That means that if she believes something, then she also believes that she believes that. And if she believes that she believes something, she's right. She does believe that. So she's self-aware in the sense that her beliefs mirror her beliefs, right? Reflect her beliefs. Okay. And now I'm going to put it into the kind of framework I was talking about, where we're going to get to a rule-extended logic, but not in a very obvious way. I will start with the classical system. I say, fine, we're going to take these principles that I just said as axioms for a normal modal logic. That would be, Bp then BBp, BBp then Bp. Okay. Now, normal modal logics there were such a cottage industry that now every single one of them has been cataloged, and they all have names, and the names it's a systematic nomenclature. And from the name, you can tell exactly what the axioms are. Okay. And this one, the one that I'm going to talk about, is called KD4C4. That tells you everything if you know the code, right? Anyway, we just have to remember these two principles here. But this classical system, I want to insist, the only way I can read it is as in third-person language, so that the B means the agent believes that. So if I say that Bp is true in a particular possible world, I mean that the designated agent of that world believes that P. Right? Okay. And I will just quickly tell you what the possible world structures are. There's a kind of recipe. If you see the axioms, you can also, you could give it to a computer. You could. The main one is this principle that I call weakly reflexive. That's my own name because it has been studied so little that there's two different names for it in that neither of them are really very informative. And as usual, evaluation means, P is true at world X. That's either for an atomic sentence, it's just T or F. And then Bp, the agent believes that P, is true at X exactly if P is true at all the worlds that are belief accessible for the agent. So this is totally standard, so I have nothing to say about it really. Okay, what about the consequences? Well, the first one is that this agent never falls into Moore's paradox. Okay? He never falls into Moore's paradox. He doesn't make either of the Moore paradox kind of mistakes ever. That's a theorem. But that's not because he believes his theory to be true. No, he doesn't have that belief. It is not a theorem that he believes that P and P, or that he believes that if P is even worse, that if P is true, then he believes it. No, he doesn't think that he is, that he is omniscient certainly, but he doesn't even believe about himself that it's not the case that for every belief he has, he believes that it is true. Okay? There's no valid principle along that line. The self-transparent believer does not believe in her own fallibility. This is all classical, okay? It's just part of the classical system. Or I won't give you this little proof, even though it's very nice. As I said, I think this is a third-person description of a believer, right? Here's the question that interests me. What is the logic that governs this believer's own thinking? As she manages her beliefs, what other beliefs do beliefs bring along with them, logically speaking? So I'm going to say that a belief set is just the set of statements that is believed by a particular agent in a particular world. So for every world, there is a belief set, namely a set of statements that this agent believes, right? And trying to find the logic of that, in the logic inside the believer's thinking, I say, well, a new kind of inference here, a new kind of validity, that P follows doxastically from X if in every belief set, if the premises X are believed, then so is that conclusion P. So there's two consequence relations now. There's the classical one, that's in that normal modal logic that we saw, right? And there's the doxastic consequence relation. Every belief set that contains X contains A as well. And this arrow, which is doxastic derivability, or doxastic entailment, what's the logic of that? I'm going to call it the inner logic of belief, because it is the logic of what happens inside the beliefs of these agents. And I think that we can now only read in the first person. For the agent himself, he doesn't say the agent believes, he says I believe. Right? And notice, I don't want the symbol to mislead you. The arrow is not a conditional connective. It's not like a horseshoe or any kind of if-then. It's an entailment relation, right? It's a derivability. Okay, we can immediately deduce from what we know about the classical system that I believe that P doxastically implies P. And P doxastically implies that I believe that P. In other words, if I believe that P, then it must also be part of my belief that P. It's a rule that has to be satisfied. And if I believe that P, then it must also be part of my belief that I believe that P. That's the second rule that has to be satisfied. Okay? And we can prove that this actually, follows from what we know about the classical system. But we can also prove very quickly that it is not the case that it's a theorem that if I believe that P, then P. And it's not the case that it's a theorem that if P, then I believe that P. So here we have exactly the situation that I talked about at the beginning. We have two rules, and we do not have the corresponding conditionals. So in the logic of inner belief, conditional proof does not hold. For the logic of inner belief, the deduction theorem is not correct. And here's the system. You see how very simple it is? You just add these two rules to your classical system, and you've got it. And you have the completeness proof, okay? Completeness theorem immediately. But because we started, let me go back. That didn't help. Previous. Okay. No. Because we started with a very well-known classical logic, this normal modal logic, we can also immediately say, yes, the inner logic of belief has a very large variety, a very large set of admissible interpretations. So it's an interesting system. Right? It's not one of these cases where you could have a triviality proof by showing that, it's only going to work if there's 4 different possible models. It's not going to be like that. Right? So because of what we started with, we can also show that we have this non-triviality. Well, I'm almost finished. I just want to now give you examples to show that and I hope it is your inner logic of belief that I'm talking about. I hope that you are a self-transparent believer, or if not, something approximating, right? That this logic that you are teaching your students is not something you use there. That in managing your own beliefs, you are using a rule-extended logic in which you don't use those natural deduction rules. Okay, so here's a counterexample. Disjunction introduction. Well, from P I will get BP, and from not P, not P. But disjunction introduction, I will get that I believe for any P at all. I believe P or I believe not P. But that's not true, right? I'm very often agnostic. Often I have no idea whatsoever, and I don't believe either. By reduction ad absurdum, you can get if I believe that P, then P. You start by assuming that it's not the case, right? And then from the first part, you would get P. And from the second part, you have not P. So you have an absurdity. Now, if by reduction ad absurdum, you can get the negation, then you say, number 1 is false. Therefore, number 6 is true. Therefore, and we know that's not the case in that logic. It's not there, right? Now, my last example, my favorite, and it's in medieval form. The first line is an assumption, right? Because I'm going to talk about conditional proof. So this is a supposition. I believe that God exists. From 1, by our first rule, I get God exists. Now, by conditional proof, I get, if I believe that God exists, then God exists. I have the conditional. And I just add an empirical fact. In fact, I do believe that God exists. Modus ponens, God exists. Shouldn't that end all theological quarrels? Well, no, of course not. I mean, there's no valid inference from belief to truth. So that means that, no, not even the hypothetical me in that example is to think like that when he's managing his own beliefs. Our inner logical belief is a rule extended logic. It is not anything like the natural deduction form of classical logic. It certainly has the original classical logic entirely in it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bas. Well, let's applaud. I think if we're in person, we would be hearing lots of applause. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. We have plenty of time for questions. There are two ways to do that. You can either use the raise your hand tool or type quill in the chat. Typing quill is the preferred way because it's easier for us to see, but I can see that Otavio raised his hand. Otavio, please, the mic's yours.
Hi, Bas. This was a great talk. Really interesting case. So, and I think you made a very persuasive case for the points about when the deduction theorem may go, and it's a beautiful use of Moore's paradox. And so, I have one question. However, I see in the logic the KD4C4 logic, right? I take it that, of course, it's not a theorem that if P, I believe P, right? But I must say that even though the rules are 2 and are 3, from P you infer that you believe P or someone believes P, and from someone believes P, then you infer P. It seems to me that's bad enough, right? Even with the failure of the deduction theorem, right? Because we are very close even there with what you call sort of some form of omniscience, right? It would be very nice if my beliefs are all true, right? But they're not, right? Often I surprise myself with finding out that all kinds of things that I believe are false, right? So the question then is, to what extent do you think, of course, you're not defending this particular logic, but I wonder if it makes sense, to what extent it's an empirically adequate logic as far as our own self-understanding of our own beliefs and our relations with them. So you're muted, Bas.
I think I can defend it because when we talk about the inner logic of belief, we're talking about what goes on inside the set of things that the person believes. And there, I think we have to put it in the first person. There, if you say BP, it means I believe that P, right? Now, imagine a person who says, I believe that P, and refuses to say P. Now, there is some incoherence there, right? Or if he says, Ondra won the climbing championship in Tokyo, and you say you believe that, and he says, sorry, okay? So there's a kind of inner incoherence.
Yeah, I agree. Read in the first person, we are in the Moore's paradox domain.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
But I thought that even though you mark it, okay, this is going to be the inner logic. I didn't thought that the inner logic was to be understood as, okay, this is actually self-person. For some reason, I was thinking, the inner logic remind me of our old friend Yvon Gauthier.
Yeah, I know that's his term. That's something else. Something else. Right,
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so, okay, let me then rephrase a little bit. I grant your point, understood in the first person, right? Yeah. What if someone does not, right? And because, for example, I may suppose that I genuinely believe that today was Wednesday, right? And so I said, I don't need to worry. My talk is only tomorrow. I have time still to finish the last slides and so on. I show up at the conference and the guy says, all right, you're next.
You're on.
And so, that would be a shock, right? To me. And so what, doesn't that put some pressure on the kind of rule from, I believe, P to B? So I could be mistaken despite that.
Well, that you have to be consistent in what you currently believe does not mean you cannot revise. So at the moment, if I believe both P and P was then if P then Q, I better believe Q as well, right? But it doesn't mean that I can't revise by saying, oh, well, I'm mistaken about P. So, throw it out. It's not like that. I think maybe the more important point you're raising is that I'm insisting that we should read it in the first person when we're looking inside the belief set. Right? If we go outside, I think that we say, look, the only assumption about the agent, I just want to talk about the agent. If the only assumption we're making about the agent is that she can be wrong about many things, she just happens to be right about what her beliefs are.
Right.
And from this, we can deduce that whenever she believes that P, then she believes that P. Mm-hmm. So that for her, the rule, if I believe that P, therefore P holds. That was not a big assumption to start with.
Right. Yeah. No, I see it. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. You can. You want coherence doesn't entail truth, right? You can revise.
Right.
Yeah. So okay. No, that's interesting. It still seems to me you're sort of navigate this very fine line, right? About how to almost assert the Moore's paradox without quite doing it. So,
yeah, I know. Well, the finer the line, the more exciting it is.
That's true. I certainly agree with that.
Sorry, I had something on another thing wrong on my Zoom, so I didn't have the light on. I guess you all saw me in sort of the super dark, but here I am.
It's okay. You look like a Rembrandt painting.
Oh, good.
Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Otávio. Any more questions from the audience? So yeah, we can type Q or F. We have some thank you from Maria Cristina Gonzalez. She thanks everyone for this wonderful meeting, and she's thankful for everything. And she hopes to see us in person again. But any more questions? Let me see if there's someone with hands raised. No. Oh, okay. Well, Bas, I think your talk. Okay. Vincenzo Ciccarelli has a quill there. Please, Vincenzo.
Oh, hello. Thanks for the nice talk. I have, perhaps I get lost at some point. So I would like to check when you were talking about the classical rules that do not hold in logic of inner belief. So at some point, it seems that the introduction of the disjunction rule doesn't hold. This is correct?
Yes, correct.
So my question is, I was wondering about the propositional logics, non-classical, in which this rule doesn't hold. Because this rule seems to be interesting because the rejection, let's say, of the introduction of the disjunction may be justified on the basis of some kind of hyper-relevance. So introduction of the disjunction seems to introduce irrelevant information in the inference. And for instance, in the logic of analytic entailment and the Angel's logic, you don't have introduction of the disjunction. And I'm not sure if your notion of tautological entailment also prevents this kind of inference. So my question is all of this may perhaps inspired or motivated by the search for some kind of hyper-relevant logic?
Well, I think there are two very distinct motivations when we start noticing the limitations of ordinary logic, right? One is that natural language is much more complex than what is represented by the logicians. And so we should just follow the cues, follow the clues in the way a scientist does, and find out how it actually works in natural language. And then if we can find examples, and we do find examples where people just reject this proof by cases, the disjunction introduction, because of the irrelevance of the parts, then we should say the rule is not actually valid for that part of natural language. That's one approach, right? The other approach is that there's a very large part, a very large subject about which we reason, in which we all agree to reason by classical logic. Mind you, we may have to say that it is the simple aspects of the world that we reason about when we do that. But it looks like it covers what people do mainly in science and in mathematics. And in a lot of ordinary reasoning, economic reasoning. And so the second motivation is to say, let's try to accommodate the anomalies, complexities, issues that we find by looking for a way of extending the classical logic so that we can keep as much as possible. So it's a bit of a conservative approach, right? Let's keep as much as possible as applying within at least certain limits, and then, add to it. And so in this particular case, for example, I want to say that the third person description of people's beliefs is quite classical. But when you start looking at something a little more interesting inside that, the inner logic of what they're actually doing when they are managing their beliefs, you will have a different kind of logic. But it is not that this person in doing that is violating the classical logic that he started with. No, he's not violating it. He's adding to it. So, as I say, these are two different approaches, and I really appreciate, the motivation for both of them, and especially the motivation for, the kind that you were talking about, which relevant logics and that whole area of research. But I would never, I think, what should I say, become partisan of either. I would just say that when it comes to philosophy of science, I tend to think that the more conservative approach fits better to our subject.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Vincenzo. Now we have a question by Fabio. Fabio Lampert, please.
Bas, thanks for the talk. I have a really quick question, which is basically just a clarification question about your point about Thomason's and Cross's results.
Yes.
So those are, I think you were talking about the the versions of the knower paradox, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so my question was, in that context, they treat knowledge or belief as a predicate, and then once you have Gödel numbers, you can generate paradox. But it's not clear that transfers to your case because you're using intentional operators. And so even if you have self-reference, it's not clear the paradoxes would arise, right? So I was wondering what the relation was.
Yeah, you are right. But if we just look at the intuitive level for how they introduce their principles, right? The intuitive motivation for putting in terms of a predicate of that pertains to the content of a sentence. At that level, it is not different from somebody who introduces an operator, right? And if Thomason shows that in this formulation, using predicates, he gets what I call Thomason's paradox, because it is really a devastating result, what he gave, right? It immediately tells us that the intuition that he gave for his axiom is now in question. And if the same intuition is grounding somebody else's operator formulation, that's in question. You're right. It's not the logical refutation of that. You're quite right. It doesn't just transfer. But I'm interested in the philosophy of the subject, right? How are we going to understand the logic in the very general, maybe English concept of logic, of language, right? Of belief. By the way, I'm very glad you brought this up, because it's what Thomason did is one of my favorite subjects. He started it when we were both back in, I think probably back when we were both at Yale still. And but he didn't publish it for a long time. He had an unpublished manuscript. I kept looking at it, and it looked like he was showing that it is impossible to have a computable representation of a person's cognitive state. That we are not computable or representable, right? Now, eventually, I thought I found some loopholes, and precisely by thinking about how does what he says about Moore's paradox relate to that basic principle that he put down as what I think was his principle too. So I'm glad you brought it up, because all of my motivation came from that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Fabio. Well, we have time for one more question. Anyone with their hands raised? Are there any questions from YouTube, perhaps? No, I don't think so. Oh, yeah, there's Otavio again. Otavio, please.
Well, let me ask you another question then, Bas. In terms of, you mentioned, I'm intrigued by this idea of this inner logic, as you thought. Now, do you think that is this typical of us as the kind of agents we are, or is this a sort of a normative logic for self-aware believers, right? And related to that, is this generalizable as a sort of a significant portion of an epistemic logic? So, how far would you push, right, these considerations, right? And or are you only considering this specific phenomena? Right?
No, I've always been very discontent with the way in which philosophers, starting with Hindika, approached the subject of belief, because they treat it as, they only want to think about the third person formulation, and it seems to me that there should be no no principle that's valid if you really think of this in a true empirical way. Because for any connection between two statements that we might think is the logic brings along one with the other, there will be somebody who just doesn't get it. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
Right? So, so I think that the entailment relation that's interesting, we can give it in an idealized form and give it some form like I did in that class in that normal modal logic, but that's not interesting because it is certainly not something empirical, and it is also not something normative because it gets too difficult for us to do, right? But instead, I think what is interesting to ask is when people believe things, right? Their beliefs may be coherent or incoherent. And I take the basic principle of incoherence is shooting yourself in the foot. Mm-hmm. I know this is a very American gun-oriented kind of thing, right? What I mean is self-sabotage by your own lights. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I've talked with Martin Push about this, who is into relativism, right? And he thought there might be no universal principle at all. And I said, well, if the person sabotages himself by his own lights, how can you object to that as a criterion? Okay. So now then we have a concept of incoherence, which is not the same as logical falsehood or anything like that, right? It's and then I think that definitely you see that when it comes to belief, some things do follow on the plane of incoherence in the sense that you could, at the very least, you could not believe the opposite without, being incoherent. Even if you're logically consistent, you're still incoherent. Okay. And I think also this applies to these discussions of subjective probability, right?
Yeah.
So that is my motivation toward the general subject.
I see. No, I see. So let me ask a related question in terms of suppose it's a situation of a classical mathematician in a crisis, right? So this mathematician, of course, he knows the axiom of choice. He knows that every set can be well ordered, but he's sort of kind of leaning towards the constructivism, but he's not quite ready to get there. So he says, look, all right, I know that this set of real numbers has the well ordering, but for the life of me, I have no idea what that would look like. How could you even conceive such a thing, right? Yeah. But he would not deny. He's a classical mathematician. His career is done or exploring the results based on the axiom of choice and so on. But he was not quite ready, despite that, to say, I believe B, right? But he's not also denying it, right? So he wanted to be agnostic. So how about, is there room in that inner logic for the mathematician in crisis, right? Who grants B, but is not quite ready to say, but I believe it. Right, but nor is he ready to say I don't believe it. Right, he doesn't want to say that either. So.
You're making a very difficult kind of case. Okay, I think there's two things that I'd like to say about it. Right, one is if you're in a crisis, logic will not get you out of it. Okay, because you're being very illogical as you're in the crisis. Right, but the other thing is I would look for what could be behind his doubt, and I think that it may really be about the concept of set, that he's not finally at ease with this, classical concept of a set, as an abstract entity, and that is reasonable to think because after all that was exactly what was happening around 1900, right? Think of the great difficulty of what period of time Russell had to actually, settle on a notion of set of a straightforward sort, right? And mind you, if if within the crisis he refuses to get out of what he's in, well then he can just dismiss it. I remember that one symposium where Pryor was there when I was a student. People were discussing how in intuitionism they don't accept excluded middle, right? And why should we be classical logicians and accept excluded middle or not? And he said, "What's the problem? Either excluded middle is true or it's not."
Hey, that's true. Easier said than done.
Easier said than done, right? Yeah, but it was funny. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, but do you think there is room? Of course, this was a kind of radical case, right? But
yes.
I know now, thinking about, for example, your own philosophical view, right? Constructive empiricism. Agnosticism is an integral part of an empiricist. Lots of things you say, look, I just don't know, right? The evidence is not enough to settle those things. Right. And I want to suspend judgment, even while following a theory, right? That will say all kinds of things that I'm not quite ready to believe, right? Nor am I ready to disbelieve. So I want to leave it open, right? So you think that the way you have set up that inner logic, agnosticism is not a problem.
No, I mean, there will be self-transparent believers who are agnostic about just about everything, right? That, in fact, are allowed for an interpretation for any theory of the system. So that means it could be practically just a tautology, if you like. It doesn't matter. Yeah. So no, any kind of agnosticism is admissible there. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, thank you, Bas. Thank you, Otávio. We have now a question from Jonas. Please, Jonas.
Well, thank you, Bas, and for this very nice talk. It is a very short question. It's more of a general question concerning your general theme. And the beginning of your talk, when you compare the axiomatic method to the natural deduction, and you mentioned that they are different. Well, most people nowadays don't like very much the axiomatic method. And they do prefer natural deduction, but you went something like the other way around. I would like to hear some thoughts of you for concerning this difference of the axiomatic approach to logic and how it can be in the way that you have developed your solution to the Moore's paradox, fruitful in opposition to other choices of proof methods.
Right. So
I think that would be a very nice argument when people appear complaining about the axiomatic method.
Well, it's not, to me, it doesn't sound like a matter of making choices, okay? We look at some part of natural language and we try to represent the language, its structure, and we do that by making up a formal model of that part of the language, right? And after that, it's not up to us anymore. What is the logic of that language? It's up to the language, right? So there's a very large part of our language that we can represent in the way we do to our first year students, or in fact, in continuing second year and third year logic students, right? A very large part of language for which the natural deduction formulation of classical logic is the correct one. Right? But you see how this is relative to the language. It's not like the logic governs the roost. It's the language. And given what the language is, that determines what the logic is. So now if we want to look at another part of our language that we use, language that is important to us, then we have to ask the question all over again. Is there a natural deduction formulation that fits that language or not? Right? But I know that for a logician, it's like the question is the other way around. So for instance, when I've talked with Leon Horsten about the theory of truth, he decided that he would, as a methodology, go for an axiomatic approach. So for him, it was not, what is the language like? The question was, what will I use as my methodology in order to produce a logic? And that's a very different motivation from, I think, how a philosopher who approaches parts of natural language, including languages of science, that's a different motivation from, what a logician has, right? So my motivation has always been just to this. We want to understand the language that we have to grapple with. So I don't answer your question, I'm sorry, because the logician will have reasons to choose one methodology over another, but it would not be a matter of choice for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Jonas. Well, we have a question now from Catherine. Please, Catherine.
Okay, I want to follow up on something Ottavio said, because I think you might get an interesting consequence out of this. Thinking about being agnostic about something. Mm-hmm. You don't just sit there being sort of quietistically saying, I don't know. Mm-hmm. You reason within your agnosticism. So don't you have, while you're doing that reasoning, don't you get embedded the very same problems all over again? Or I don't know, problem solutions. If I accept, although I remain sort of agnostic about the axiom of choice, and I reason through it, then I'm going to get the same issues back again that I had with I believe, but don't believe that I believe. So I think you might have sort of this nested Russian dolls of the same thing going on within the range of things one is agnostic about.
If I'm agnostic about the axiom of choice, I'm perfectly capable still of saying within classical logic what's going to follow from the axiom of choice. I will be able to follow the proof that it implies the will ordering principle, right? But if I'm agnostic about axiom of choice, then I will be a person standing outside that, looking in. And I may say, but every consequence, that makes me feel worse about it. For example, that's even worse. That's even more unbelievable. That's even more like, Brouwer would say, that's just metaphysics, and it's more metaphysics, right? So you are reasoning logically within that context. You've bracketed the subject. But I think that it's not inevitable that you will get into paradoxes. If you do, then you'll probably take that out and show it to someone and say, maybe that subject is not, maybe that doesn't work. And of course, there were cases where they did that. So when they first had this proof that you could take things that were of different volume and somehow happen equivalently onto something of a smaller volume, that made no sense. That was offered, that was a possible objection, was a possible reason at that time for rejecting the axiom. Now, as it happened historically, people just never took it. They just took it because the system worked well, without, there was no real contradiction, right? Paradox is not an easy subject by itself. It points in one direction to logical inconsistency, and in another direction to just unacceptability of some sort. And very often people try to solve or dissolve the paradox by showing that there's an underlying inconsistency. But the interesting cases are where there is not.
Yeah.
Right. So I see the danger that you are pointing to. I don't see that this is inevitably going to happen.
Okay, fine.
Well, Well, thank you, Bas. Thank you, Catherine. Now we have a question from my colleague Darley Dallagnol. Please, Darley.
Oh, Professor Van Fraassen, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I have two questions on the conditions under which the Moore's paradox appear or it can be solved, let's say. So you build up a kind of logic that avoids the paradox.
Yes.
But my question is whether or not common sense or ordinary language has not resource to dissolve the paradox. For instance, if I say it is raining, but I don't believe, the assumption is that I am asserting that it's raining. But if I'm not asserting, just stating, let's say, it's better not to believe if the proposition is false. And another example, in some contexts, in some language games, let's say, if you say P and I don't believe P, and you substitute this for instance, my dearest friend died, but I don't believe, you are just expressing that you cannot help believing that this could happen. So my question is this: common sense and natural language seems to have resources to avoid Moore's paradox or Moore's absurdity, because even the name Moore's paradox is something that Wittgenstein gave the name, but Moore's was thinking on something like this. It's just absurd to state.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's... Yeah? Okay.
Well, let me... I think that you're right that in natural language, there are these straightforward reactions in a natural discourse, natural conversation. If somebody says it's raining in Tokyo, then we automatically assume that he's expressing a belief that he's right. If we then ask him, do you believe it? We'd be very disturbed to hear him saying, no, I don't believe that. Right? Not only this, we'd be disturbed, not because it is a straightforward case of Moore's paradox, right? We would be disturbed because we had taken him to somehow convey, in addition to his assertion, that he believed it, right? But imagine that. Imagine something really science fiction that what you believe is automatically written on the wall behind you, right? And if you want to know not just what is the case in the world, but what it is that you believe, you can always turn around and look at the wall. And now I'm looking at you at the moment, and right just behind you on the wall, it says, it is raining in Tokyo. And I ask you, do you believe that it's raining in Tokyo? And you turn your head and you look on the wall and you say, no, there's nothing there, right? Now, you have not contradicted yourself, right? You have not contradicted yourself, but something else is wrong. And, it's what I like to call a pragmatic inconsistency. So to me, it's similar to somebody who says, listen, you promised me a bicycle for Christmas. And I answer you, yeah, I remember on your birthday, I said I would give you a bicycle for Christmas. And you say, well, no bicycle. You're breaking your promise. And I say, no. I'm not breaking any promise. At the time, I was lying. When I said I was making a promise, I lied. Now, there's something very wrong with this, right? But it is not a logical inconsistency. It's rather that it's part of our, the pragmatics of our discourse that we make these connections. And certainly, I think it's up to the logician to, to take that seriously and to bring it out. Yeah. So I totally agree with you about that. Sorry.
Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Darley. Bas, I have one short question, and I think perhaps it escapes the topic. I don't know. There's a book organized by Greg Frost Arnold called Carnap, Tarski, and Wine at Harvard.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea is that these three guys are at Harvard, I think in their early 40s, and they meet weekly, and sometimes Bertrand Russell joins them and all that. And the fact is that Carnap kept register in his diaries about their discussions. And Greg Frost Arnold dug this up from the archives in Pittsburgh, and he makes some comments. And there's one particular point in those diaries that I think it's quite puzzling, is that the four fellows, they wonder if you meet someone who reasons under a different logic from ours, would we be able to realize that they're under a different logic just from their overt behavior?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think, so you made a rational reconstruction of beliefs and all that. Do you think we would be able to realize if someone works under that different logic for some reason?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that in the case, in the example that I was working with, we would be able to tell. Not in general, perhaps, but in this case, we would at least not be able to say what the outer logic was, perhaps. We could only speculate about maybe. But the inner logic, if that person says it's raining in Tokyo, and he refuses to say, I believe that it's raining in Tokyo, then certainly the inner logic of belief is different from what I was representing. Right? I have to admit this possibility. The worst case would be if he says something contrary to what I think is required on the plane of incoherence. And he says, no, I do not believe. Right? And in that case, I would say, well, then my reconstruction does not apply to you right from the beginning. And either you're not a self-transparent believer, or classical modal logic is not a good classical system to start with, and I represent your language. But it's whatever is right for you is definitely different from this. But I must admit that the question that you're raising is much more profound than that. I think that, no, it's true. I mean, I think that in general, guesses about what a person's logic is are speculations that have a very poor foundation. And the same about his conceptual system, his whatever you want to call it, his underlying fundamental project, right? We can only offer these things as theories, and they are based on representations which themselves are fragile. So, yeah, I'm not going to be, I hope not to be naive about this.
Thank you, Bas. Well, I think this question made Otavio ask another one. So please, Otavio.
To follow up, I think it's a really interesting case, Ivan, that you raised. But in light of, Bas, your response, I wonder, how can anyone know what the logic the person is using, even the inner logic, right? Because you may think that you're following those rules, right? Mm-hmm. But for all you know, there might be extensions of those systems that agree with those rules, but disagree with other things you haven't thought about yet.
Yeah. I was going for the negative, which was easier, right? Yeah, no, I do not think that I can just conclude, if I don't find any counterexamples that this is the right one. No, you're quite right. Yeah.
Right. Good.
Oh, Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Otávio. I think we can all thank Bas for his great talk and great discussions once again. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to make a short closing speech or something like that. Just a big thank you for everyone. We reached the end of another Principia Symposium. And in my view, and I think I speak for the organizing committee as a whole, the symposium has been a success in spite of the far from ideal circumstances in which we're in. I mean, we're all locked at home or something like that, and we're meeting through machines and whatever. Well, I've seen a lot of great philosophy being done and being discussed here in these 4 days. In regard to that, I really must thank my friends in the organizing committee, Jerzy, Jonas, Cesar, Alexandre. This would never be possible without you. This is a great team. This is a great group of friends. And I also must thank the staff. This would be impossible without them. So I'd say thank you to Walter, to Bruno, to Thalita, to Caio, Juan, Emanuela, Rodrigo, Félix, Renato, Gabriel, Raoni, Gabriele, Paulo, Ítalo, Mateus, Kirian, Luis. I think I didn't forget anyone. If I did, please tell me right now. This is not by any problem or anything. It's just a matter of memory. You guys did a great job. Principia will always be safe in your hands. It's been a wonderful time. It's been a wonderful experience to work with you. I also would like to thank the invited speakers, Catherine Elgin, Gustavo Capone, Nancy Nersessian, Anjan Chakravarti, Alberto Cupani, Hugh Lacey, Pablo Mariconda, who couldn't be here, but thank you, Pablo. Luis Henrique Dutra also couldn't be here, but thank you for sending the text and allowing our pre-recorded presentation. Thank you, Otávio Bueno. Thank you always. You're always a great friend, always present in everything we do in Florianopolis. Also thank Décio Krause and also, well, Bas van Fraassen. We cannot thank you enough, and that's it. Well, of course, I also must thank all of you who are watching or who have contributed to the symposium, in the talks, in the discussions, in the coffee breaks, in everything that we did this week. Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm reception. Thank you for making this online conference a wonderful experience for us all. We rocked, okay? I opened the symposium saying that philosophy and science are enduring a difficult moment in our country. Well, this 12th Principia Symposium has been a sign that we are resisting. We did it. And I'd like to close the ceremony by saying that we will keep resisting. Don't worry about that. We're going to be here, hopefully, in person in 2 years. The pandemic's made us come up with a new model for the Principia Symposium, and now we even know how to do it online. There's no stopping us. We don't know which model we're going to use for the next symposium. We have no idea for the main theme yet. We have uncertainty in regard to funding. The only certainty is that there will be the 13th Principia International Symposium in 2023. So see you in 2 years, or better saying, see you soon at the party. Yeah, we're having a party right now. So thank you, everybody. Good evening, good night, and well, see you soon.
Thank you so much, Ivan.